GEM International is a new diamond explorer in the richest diamond producing country in Africa, located next to the fourth largest producing diamond mine in the world. International Spotlight is on an 1109 carat diamond recently discovered in Africa by a fellow Canadian junior with a proven operator and finance team. GEM International trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol GI. Visit us at gemdiamondmining.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Hilliard MacBeth, author of the book When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. He's also a portfolio manager and financial advisor in Edmonton. Welcome back to the show, Hilliard.
Hello, Jim.
I guess the big news in Alberta is that Donald Trump has given tentative approval to the XL pipeline.
Yes, so the last phase of the Keystone pipeline, which originally started a long time ago, which is called the XL, had been held up because Obama refused to approve it in 2015, and now today the new President Trump has said he will approve it, although he added some conditions to that. He said the pipe has to be built in the U.S. and it has to create jobs in the U.S. and they have to make money out of it. So you think he's trying to maybe renegotiate the terms, but it actually is phase 4. There was 3 previous phases, and this phase actually, the phase 4 phase that he talked about today, actually benefits North Dakota as much as it does Alberta. Alberta's really happy, I think, to get it because we allows Alberta to move some heavy diluted bitumen from the oil sands all the way down to Texas, and also some synthetic crude. But the magic to it is there's a bunch of very light crude in the Williston Basin in North Dakota and Montana that can also be mixed in with it, and the two travel much better together than either one. So there's a lot of crude that's been discovered in the Williston Basin, and the production increases are dramatic because of fracking and shale oil, and they need the Keystone XL just as much as Alberta does. So it's a very encouraging step.
Now, of course, BC got the agreement for the Kinder Morgan pipeline to go through from Edmonton to Burnaby, with the provision that the pipeline pay BC, I don't know, $50 million or something like that. Would Trump be looking for a deal like that too? Give us a little bit of the oil royalty flowing through those pipelines.
Yeah, it seemed like from what I just saw briefly the announcement, and it sounded like he was making similar noises, like he wants to get some kind of benefit. But the whole pipeline benefits the U.S. already, in that there's a lot of oil building up in the northern part of the U.S. that needs to move as well. So I really don't know how that all works out. There's so many pipelines in existence all across the United States and Canada, and the idea that people should pay money to be able to pass through is a brand new thing. I think BC maybe started it, and hopefully it doesn't catch on too much, because these pipelines are really essential. To give you some idea, there's something like 9.4 million barrels a day. It's maybe a little lower than that in the U.S. now because of lower oil prices, but say 9 million barrels. And we're talking about 500,000 barrels, so it's a pretty small amount, but it is significant as well.
And of course, too, even if it was just a break even, you have a way to get the product out, and you're not just beholden to one or two customers.
No, and they're saying actually, I'm not the expert on this, but I have read that a lot of this oil that will go through the Keystone XL will actually be exported. There's a lot of things happening in the U.S., very positive things with oil, and one of them is that they're not self-sufficient yet. They still import a lot of oil, but they're starting to export oil as well. So when this Keystone is completed, and it shouldn't take very long, my understanding was that they had the pipe all ready to go, and they could do it fairly quickly, although there's always a chance there'll be some protests as well. But they should be able to increase their exports quite dramatically. It'll go to the refineries in Texas, probably, and then possibly be exported. And it's a natural progression in the integrated energy system in North America. But at the same time as we're talking about that, on the other hand, Trump's talking about tearing up NAFTA and America first. So it is a very huge amount of uncertainty right now.
Well, the Prime Minister has said that the NAFTA talks so far, informal talks, have been very positive. A prominent U.S. business tycoon has said he could see Canada and the U.S. drawing up their own bilateral trade deal to benefit both countries. And he's quoted as saying, right now, it's balanced trade between the U.S. and Canada. They're both very reliant on each other. And so it wouldn't make sense to ruin that very positive relationship. So he said, really, he could see a deal being drawn up between Canada and the U.S., excluding Mexico.
Yeah, so NAFTA was the last agreement, but there were two agreements before that. There was the, going way back, there was the Auto Pact, I think 1964 or something like that. And then after that, I think Mulroney did the, I think it was Mulroney did the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And as it turns out, I was surprised to learn this recently, if NAFTA gets torn up, and the U.S., I think you and I talked about this once before, the U.S. actually can back out of NAFTA, any one of the three parties could back out, just all it requires is 6 months' notice. But in the case of Canada, it's different from Mexico. In the case of Canada, we still have the U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So what they did was when they put NAFTA in, they said, okay, we'll put the Free Trade Agreement on hold, and we'll go with NAFTA. But in the case that NAFTA doesn't work out or it gets canceled or anything, then the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement would come back into force immediately, and there wouldn't have to be any negotiations about that. So basically, what would happen there is they'd cancel NAFTA, Mexico would be out in the cold, and Canada and the U.S. would still have this free trade agreement, which would be a great thing for Ontario because of the automobile industry, Southern Ontario. And but really Canada isn't much threat to the United States in terms of jobs. That seems to be the main focus of the new president of the United States, because our wages are just as high as, in fact, our wages are probably higher than the U.S. wages in a lot of cases, and certainly higher in Ontario than the wages are in southern U.S. and some of those right-to-work states. I think the numbers are roughly $30 or $40 an hour on average. But in Mexico, the wages are $4 an hour. So the real concern is Mexico. That's where all of the new investments have been going for auto plants. And that's where the U.S. has no chance at all of being competitive. I mean, I don't know. I really don't know what they think is going to happen if they block Mexican trade with the U.S. There's no way they're going to be able to come up with equivalent of $4 an hour employment in any part of the U.S. So their costs are going to go up quite dramatically. But Canada is not such a big threat. As you mentioned, the trade is relatively balanced between the two countries. It's not a big surplus. There is a small surplus, but it's pretty tiny. But also, we're not a threat because our costs are similar.
And also, too, Canada-U.S., that is the world's biggest trading bloc. You don't want to mess with a good thing. You hope.
Well, you wouldn't think so, but I mean, when you hear what some of the things that Trump says, you wonder sometimes what, he doesn't seem to care about that stuff. I think that's one of the things that people like about him. He's not tied to the past, and he's not worried about breaking conventions and that sort of thing. But there's one more thing I want to we haven't talked about yet, which is you may have heard President Trump talk about slapping a tax on the border, and what that is, I had to dig into it, and it's not widely known, but there is actually a well thought out and outlined and long-standing proposal, which is actually coming out of the House of Representatives under the Republicans. Paul Ryan and a fellow named Kevin Brady from Texas have been working on this for a number of years. And basically what it is, it's a tax on imports and a subsidy for exports. And what it does is it removes the situation where there's an incentive for American companies to move all of their production overseas. Like, a lot of companies have moved with these inversions, they've moved their head office to Ireland or someplace like that, and then sold goods back into the U.S. Well, this proposal, it's called the border adjustment tax, and it's also got a longer name, destination-based cash flow tax. And you're going to hear more about it. And Donald Trump was asked about it, and he said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't really love it. It's too complicated." He said, but it actually is simpler than the current system that they have. This current system, the IRS has to figure out how to tax these companies on all of their worldwide income if they're based in the U.S. And of course, they get into all this stuff with transfer payments and all that kind of stuff. Well, the new system, the border adjusted tax, to use a simpler name, gets rid of all that. And if a company produces $1 billion in the United States and it imports $1 billion and it exports $1 billion, then there'll be a much lower new tax applied to them, and there won't be any disadvantage at all. And if they happen to export more than they import, which is what the U.S. wants, then they'll actually save money on the tax, and they could easily get to a position where they have paid zero tax if they did it right. So I could see the appeal to the new government, because the headline would say companies moving back to the United States and corporate tax lowered from 35% down to 20%, and a bunch of other kind of neat things that would happen. It would be very positive. The one group, though, so it'd be great for Boeing, for example, but it wouldn't be good for Walmart. And there's a real question mark over automobile manufacturers who tend to import engines and then, build the car maybe in the U.S., but import a lot of the components. So that would be very difficult for some of those people. So it may not go ahead, but I suspect you're going to hear a lot more about it.
We'll have more with Hilliard MacBeth right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Hilliard MacBeth. Hilliard, perhaps one thing Mr. Trump doesn't realize is new factories do not equate to new jobs. Adidas recently closed their factories in China, throwing 1 million people out of work to build a mass factory in Germany. But that factory in Germany will use robots. So maybe you have 50, 60 people employed, not 1 million.
Yeah, I did some research on that, and it turns out that the job losses that Donald Trump is so concerned about, and then I guess to a large degree he got elected on in those states where people had lost, there have been such a large number of factories shutting down. Most of it hasn't been to do with trade at all. It's exactly what you're saying. It's about robots. And so those jobs disappeared, but they didn't move anywhere. They didn't go away. They didn't move to another country. They just disappeared altogether. And so it's kind of like he's fighting an argument that is, it's an old argument that doesn't really exist anymore. And I don't know. I think it plays well politically in some parts of the United States, but the risk for the United States is they're just going to leave themselves behind. If they actually try and recreate these old assembly line jobs, they're going back to an era that really doesn't exist anymore.
And plus the products would be so expensive, who would buy them?
Exactly. And that's the other thing that I don't see that discussed at all. And there's no question of cost. There's talking about, jobs and all that, but costs are higher with people than they are with robots. So, there's an example of a new factory for new electric cars that Tesla has in California, and it's very automated. And, the new president should be touting that as a major accomplishment. All of their cars are manufactured in the United States, but I don't think they employ that many people. They do in the design phase, the engineering phase, but not in the actual production phase. And I really don't know if you really want to go back to those jobs anyway. It seems like a lot of those jobs were very repetitive and probably very boring. I never worked on an assembly line, but I can imagine it must be extremely boring. And so that era, that Detroit, auto workers union kind of situation is I think we moved on from that.
Well, moving on to something else, the CMHC says the super high prices in the Greater Toronto area are now spilling over to the rest of Ontario. Is that the way it usually works? I mean, we saw that with the Vancouver super high prices a year ago and how that affected prices outward even into Kelowna and Victoria. Is this something that they should be worried about in Ontario, or should they just keep welcoming the real estate money?
This is such an unusual situation. First of all, Ontario, they used to say it was a two bubble real estate market, Toronto and Vancouver, and now Vancouver seems to have rolled over, and there's some pretty significant price declines in parts of Vancouver. At the high end, anyway. I don't know about the low end, but I don't know if there is even a low end in Vancouver. but you know what I mean. But so now it's just down to Toronto, and it's almost like the CMHC is trying to keep it going by printing these stories and saying, well, it's spreading to Hamilton, and it's just so unusual. There's nothing normal about this at all. So it's really hard to know. I mean, I think the speculative drive is alive, and as people have seen prices rise, and they continue to believe that prices will continue to rise. It's amazing. I talked to people in Toronto. I was just talking to somebody today in Halifax. Even though prices are very weak in Alberta, and they're starting to roll over, or they have rolled over in Vancouver and other places, wherever people live, they believe that the prices will keep rising forever. And of course, mathematically they can't. If they keep going up at 7% a year, they double every 10 years. And we would just finish talking about what's happening in the United States with free trade and all that stuff, and the incomes are not going up. In fact, there's a good chance the incomes will go down a little bit. Our some of our wages are probably too high, and this pressure from Trump and protectionism is probably going to have a big impact on Canada. So the idea that house prices would keep rising is just crazy. And, I don't know why CMHC puts out stories like that, because I think sometimes it just fuels the fire. I did talk to, last week I talked to a former colleague who sold his house in Toronto for a massive gain, and he's moving, but he's retiring, so it's not like he's going to be commuting. He's moving to a much cheaper location. You don't have to go very far out of Toronto. Once you get away from the commuting distance and away from the GO train and prices are much, much lower. I was in London, Ontario not that long ago, and a really nice house cost $300,000 there. So, if you get away from the necessity to work in Toronto, but I did have a call from a reporter, and they said that one of the economists from the bank was saying that prices will keep going higher from one of the banks, because Toronto and Vancouver have become global cities. So, maybe they are global cities. I don't think so. I doubt it very much.
Well, they call it trophy real estate, don't they?
Well, trophy real estate is like that, what was that house in Point Grey not that long ago?
Peter Brown's house.
Peter Brown's house is sold for
$30
million or something, and is bought by a teenager or something.
A so-called teenage student, yes, who didn't know what her dad did.
Exactly. And so that's a trophy, but really, we're just talking about run-of-the-mill $1 to $2 million homes in Toronto, and there's no way that people seeking trophy assets are that interested in $1 million homes that are maybe teardowns in Toronto. So no, it has to be the local people, and the local people, in order to be able to buy that stuff, have to have the incomes and the jobs. That's just. You can deviate from that for a year or two or three, I guess, in the case of a massive bubble like we have now. But you can't deviate from it forever. Eventually, the incomes and the jobs have to be there to support those prices, or as we're discovering in Alberta, the prices have to come down. Those are the only two possibilities, and I don't see anything on the horizon that indicates that incomes would rise enough to justify the kind of prices that are happening in Toronto. It just doesn't. And of course, on the other side, of course, part of what made it possible without the incomes was the fact that the interest rate costs were so cheap And so people could, even with $100,000 income, they could pretend for a while that they could afford $1 million house, because the interest rates were so low. But that's coming to an end very rapidly because of the changes with CMHC and the bank financing. It'll be very interesting to see when these changes start to bite into the costs, because the lenders can't give people 2 or 3% interest rate mortgages in Canada when interest rates in the U.S. are 4 or 5%, which seems to be very much where we're headed. So they're going to have to be priced properly. And who would invest in a mortgage in Canada at 3% when they could put their money into U.S. government bonds at 4%? It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, Hilliard, perhaps it's a good reason for people to go out and buy your book, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash.
Well, I hope that people read it before all this happens, rather than waiting till after it happens and saying, was there a guy that was predicting this? But the other thing I would mention for people is that I do write a weekly note, and you can find it on the MacBethGroup.com, or just under me on Twitter at HMACBE, or just type in Hilliard MacBeth and you can get a link. So I put it out, and I tweet out the link to it, and there's a lot of interesting topics, because the book was written about 2 years ago, so we try to bring people up to date on it with timely stuff every week.
Hilliard, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you, Jim.
My guest has been Hilliard MacBeth, author of the book, When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. His website, macbethgroup.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show can be emailed to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.